Hello, Internet. So, the other day, I was reading this book. Well, it's called All the Light We Cannot See, and it's a novel set in the Second World War. Basically, the story follows this blind girl called Mary Laure and her experience during the Nazi occupation of France. Now, it's a great novel so far, and I would totally recommend it, but it got me wondering. You see, the book focuses in the ways in which Mary Laure is able to survive the horrors of the war, and it's really good at helping us imagine what it would feel like to fight an invisible enemy, one you've never seen before. In fact, imagination is sort of a central theme in the novel, and the author makes this point that it is actually one of our most valuable survival abilities. But how does imagination work anyway? Like, what happens in our brains when we imagine something? And let alone that, most importantly, how in the world can we imagine something which we haven't seen before? Now, this question really made my head hurt, but it was too complicated, and definitely my brain couldn't cope with this kind of stuff so early on, so I decided to start off with a simpler question, alright? How can our brains imagine things which we've already seen? Well, we have to look at some philosophy. Now, don't click off the video, please. I know philosophy is boring nerd shit, but bear with me. You see, the ancients thought that imagination and knowledge itself as a whole was like this sort of hidden hard drive that the gods put in our heads from the moment that we were born. They called this forms. Essentially, they thought that we had all the knowledge of the universe and all the memories we needed to have in our memories, but then we were too dumb to even remember half of them. So we had to think about stuff in order to unencrypt it or something. Now, this idea was fine with people until sort of the 18th century came along, when philosophers started to think that we were a bunch of arrogant pricks for thinking or for comparing ourselves or our knowledge to that of God. So they proposed another theory. They proposed that, in fact, imagination did not come from, and knowledge itself did not come all from birth, but instead you were able to imagine things because you had a previous memory of that object, and so when you were, or that thing, and so when you were recalling that object in your imagination, you simply just had to bring up that memory into your head. And this also made sense, but my man Sartre wasn't vibing with this theory either. He said that the image in our heads, right, it has nothing to do with the real object. And so it can't possibly be a manifestation or some kind of memory of that real object. Instead, he argued that the mental image of the object is actually just a combination of all of the features that we remember seeing from that object. He called this a complete representation of the object. Now, okay. That's it for the boring philosophy. Now, let's have some fun. Imagine a tomato. Come on, please, do it. I know it's not fun. Done? Now, I'm sure that was a piece of cake for you. Anyway, as I was saying, that was probably quite easy for you, because you've seen a tomato before, and well, you know what one looks like, no? They look like this, right? Yeah, yes, they do look like that, you are right. And again, if I asked you why you could do this, your answer would be, well, again, I've seen tomatoes before, so I know what one looks like. And again, yes, you are right. But see, they're also tomatoes. Now, I never told you to imagine a red, round tomato, did I? And despite this, chances are that most of you probably imagined the first tomato and not these. So why is this? Now, following Sartre's idea, you maybe can start to see where I'm going with this. But screw philosophy, right? Like, get out of here. Here in this channel, we're science girls and boys. So let's look at what's going on in our brains when we imagine something. So, as we've said, this whole process really starts with the observation in the real world. So what happens is that whenever you look at something, a very specific group of neurons in your head fire, which sort of log the key features of the object you are looking at. Now, neuroscientists call all of these groups of neurons all together a neuronal ensemble, and every object you have ever looked at has its own very specific neuronal ensemble. Now, when you look at, say, the tomato, you can imagine this as being, for instance, a group of neurons firing which notice the red color, another group of neurons which notice its round shape, and a third group of neurons which notices its green branch thingy. Now, I'm not saying this is exactly how it happens. I'm not a neuroscientist, please don't sue me. But you can think of it in that way, because then we can explain the mental image in a very simple way. Essentially, when you imagine then the tomato, it's just simply the reverse process, right? So now, for all of those groups of neurons that caught those key features of the tomato now will fire all at the same time in your brain, and so this mental model of the tomato is formed. What you imagine is not really a tomato. It just has the most common color and shape of a tomato. Now, personally, I found this fascinating, but it still doesn't answer our first question, right? Like, how can you explain that I can imagine something which I haven't seen before? Now, both neuroscience and the boy Sartre assume one thing. You need to gain enough information about the object through observation before you can imagine it. So if this is the case, then how do we explain the fact that we can all perfectly imagine a cat wearing boots doing tap dance on top of an elephant? Now, remember when we used to role play with our friends as kids? If you had any friends, that is. Imagining we were pirates or Formula One pilots or superheroes. Now, I remember playing superheroes and completely understanding what being Spider-Man would feel like. And now, of course, I had no prior experience being Spider-Man, but somehow what I had seen in TV, comics, and movies was enough for my brain to fill in the gaps and allow me to perfectly envision what it would feel like to web swing around New York. This is sort of the theory that my man Sartre was going for when he argued that in order to form a mental image of something, you don't need all that much information about the object or the subject. You just need a bit of knowledge, and our brains have this amazing ability of filling in the gap. And this is also the reason why when you read, you can imagine these fictional scenarios and settings in your head, even if you haven't seen them. Essentially, images, words, sounds, etc. act as a substitute for sensory data, allowing us to build these fictional worlds in our head, even if in real life we haven't really experienced them all that much, which is something which children are very good at. Now, this feels really complete, but I wasn't satisfied with this answer. You see, it might just be me being dumb, but I just found it confusing. Like, what do you mean by partial knowledge, and just how much information do we need in order to imagine something? So at this point, it was back to science. So how can science explain why I can imagine a cat wearing boots, even though I haven't seen one? Well, remember how a group of neurons would fire whenever you imagine an object that you had seen in real life? And remember how each object that you had ever seen has its own very specific neuronal ensemble associated to it? Well, what would happen if two neuronal ensembles would fire at the same time? Like, for instance, what would happen if the neurons responsible for helping me imagine a cat and those responsible for making me imagine a pair of boots fired at the same time in my brain, so that essentially the two images, the cat and the boots, superpose themselves in my brain, allowing me to imagine a cat wearing boots even though I haven't seen one. Well, as surprising as this may seem, it's actually as simple as that. It's actually a process called mental synthesis. The thing is, it's not simple at all. Because you see, in order for this process to be successful, the two neuronal ensembles have to fire both at the very same time in synchronization. Otherwise, the mental model will fail. So it's an incredibly complex task which proves how unique and how advanced our brains and our imaginations really are. Because, again, you can imagine this is a very simple example, but you can sort of see how complicated it would be for our brains, for instance, to imagine a character simply from its description from a book, for instance, if you read and you're a nerd like me. Like, your brain has to process and superpose huge amounts of words, hundreds and thousands of words from the description in order to synthesize them into a character which you have never seen. All without us ever having to make a conscious effort. So at this point, I was pretty okay with the explanation, and I hope you are too. But you see, it raised another question, because this is cool and all, and I'm not saying I don't like imagining stuff, I think it's great, but why do we have this ability? Like, what purpose does imagination serve in the first place? Now, the answer to this question is actually really cool. But let's be honest, no one in their right mind is willing to put up with another 10 minutes of me speaking. So I decided to break this video up into two parts. In the next part, we'll look at why we evolved imaginations, what purpose they serve, and we'll see that, in fact, imaginations might just be our most valuable skill. So until then, if you made it this far into the video, mad respect. Thanks for watching this episode of Shower Thoughts. Please feel free to drop a like if you enjoyed. Also, comment anything you would like down below. And also, be sure to subscribe to the channel so I can finally say I have some friends. So that you don't miss any future videos. And see you soon. Peace.